It seems you can't take a step in Europe or the West, certainly, without being condemned for anti-Semitism if you so much as say the word Jewish attaching any other label to it. So, for instance, if I were to attach the label Jewish extremism, that might, uh, result in a shriek of horror from anybody, or a nervousness at least. If I say the word Muslim extremism, people wouldn't bat an eyelid. It's just the norm. You see it all across the papers, newspapers every day. Commentators, political analysts, politicians themselves. Islam and Muslims are open season when you come to attaching the label or the stereotype of extremism. What would happen if I talked about Jewish extremism or Christian extremism? Certainly, eyes get raised, and the label wouldn't sit so comfortably with I would imagine our Jewish diaspora across the West as well. Of course, the problem of Jewishness of that kind is linked to Israel primarily and to the Zionist problem. Now, take it or leave it, Zionism is a political ideology. It's not a religion. Although some would say it's turning into a form of dictatorial religion. And Jewishness isn't necessarily equating you to being a Zionist. Just as, following Israel or denouncing Israel doesn't make you anti-Semitic. So calling somebody a Jewish extremist, does that make you anti-Semitic? Well, Jeremy Corbyn was obviously the highest profile political leader or individual in this country who's taken the fall around the issue of anti-Semitism, Jewish extremism, Zionism, Israel, etc. It impacted his leadership, his party, and in fact, some would argue, even lost Labour the election. Well, Kashif's written a very interesting piece around this. So I'm going to really defer to Kashif first. And welcome to the show, Kashif.
Assalamu alaikum, Mohsin. Thank you very much for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Wa alaikum assalam. And we're speaking at the moment on the occasion of what's certainly for the Shia Muslims and for most people who know a little bit about Islamic history, the day when we assert that guardianship of humanity and guardianship of Muslims in particular, but humanity was passed on to Imam Ali alayhi salam, the fourth Khalif for some, the first Imam for others. Either way, a figure who does unite Muslims and a figure who actually had his own, if you like, engagements with Jews of his time, just as the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did, and just as the Holy Quran is littered with references to Jews and to our duties or responsibilities or relationship with them. We're not scared of talking about the Jewish issue in Islam or amongst Muslims. But here in the West, arguably we're treading on eggshells now, where a kind of climate of fear that's been created around the idea of Jewish or Israeli exceptionalism, or is it Zionist exceptionalism? First, give me an overview of what made you write this article about, what you'd termed Jewish gaylords, anti-Semitism, homophobia, and the unsustainable hypocrisy of selective outrage. What's this business of selective outrage that you're talking about?
Well, yeah, it just numerous articles over the course of many years. In fact, ever since 2001, you could say, where certain kind of outrage and hypocrisy applied to events involving Muslims or Christians, let's say, and a kind of event, perhaps even worse, was ignored totally by the media. So that's what I meant by the regards to Jewishism. I know not everyone might share this view, but I think Zionism is Judaism as practiced in what I would say the illegitimate state of Israel and by pro-Israeli Jews around the world. That's just my assessment of it. So those were some of the reasons that prompted.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. That's in itself that connection between Judaism as practiced by Israel and a lot of their supporting diaspora. Of course, you have groups like Naturo Kartai who would immediately say, well, we're nothing to do with that kind of what you describe as Jewish extremism, and actually it's not Jewish at all. It's Zionism, an ideology which hijacked Judaism. This is what Rabbi Cohen has said to me on several occasions when I've met him or interviewed him. So we're not, first of all, lumping all Jews into this extremism label here, are we?
No, no. For me, the term Zionism was taken a bit of a catch-all term. So for me, when I say Jewish extremists or Jewish fanatics, there is open the door for secular and moderate scientists to also present their ideas and their views. It could be like you said, the Natura Carta. They're not pro-Israeli, so their Judaism would differ from those who support the apartheid regime over there. Similarly, would be a secular Jew. Lots of other people who normally they're not normally being Jewish per se, because we're always concerned about, oh, will I be accused of anti-Semitism if I say the word Jew or extremist? For me, in some ways, allow the Jewish to become involved in this. Say, look, there are elements within our community who are extreme. There are others who are secular. There are, and for me, those Jews who would support Israel, which is an apartheid regime in my view, they would be considered Jewish extremists as far as.
Well, that's fascinating. Of course, here it matters because regardless of whether people want to again shriek in horror, it's a reality that there is a strong political, if you like, representation, an overrepresentation, some would argue, of Jewish fraternity within Parliament, for instance. So in the circles of power, and certainly say even with media outfits, certainly people who are either Jewish or have got very strong leanings towards Zionism, do hold extraordinary power. That's kind of undeniable. The likes of Rupert Murdoch, perhaps Rob Maxwell, who went disappeared on his yacht mysteriously, was a well-known Mossad agent, an Israeli supporter, and working within British Parliament. Just one example, but I remember from Margaret Thatcher's days, it was very clear. I mean, Keith Joe could name Nigel Lawson. There were many others on that cabinet, for instance, in power under Thatcher, who were openly Jewish. Not to mention the concept of taqiyya, many who may even be hiding their connections to Zionism, or may even be just Christian Zionists. For instance, that's a very large lobby in Parliament itself. Either way, whether it's Jewish or whether it's just people who have allegiances to Zionism, it has an extraordinary power within our, if you like, structure here, our elitist structure, or even the political, levers of power, let alone the economic levers and the media levers of power that are exercised. Does that idea of a potential Jewish extremism within all this infrastructure worry you, given that if anybody was to find out that, say, Hezbollah or Hamas or people that are labeled often by Zaya Western establishment as terrorists or as violent extremists or ex-extremists, if they had any influence within Parliament, etc., or our levers of systemic management in this country, there'd be an uproar, wouldn't there? But there's no uproar about the Israeli lobby, arguably, in Parliament, for instance.
I know, yes, and because to some extent, I think it's our fault. To some extent, we appease the Israel lobby, right? Because many people they say, oh, we don't want to be deplatformed, or we want to have at least a little bit of media, so we're not going to anything. And it's just a simple case of the more you give, the more they'll take. And that's why. And you mentioned Margaret Thatcher. Reminds me, at that time, even though there were a lot of Zionist Jews in the cabinet, the British establishment, I don't think, had not been as thoroughly co-opted, and the media, to some extent, was not as compromised then as it is now. Because I seem to remember Margaret Thatcher, for all her ills, she actually stopped Menachem Begin from coming over. I mean, he did come here, but there was opposition within the what you would call the high church Tory party at the time to having a Jewish terrorist of the Irgun gang, because there were protests, in fact, by not predominantly not by Muslims at that time. It was mainly white British people who were out there protesting against Menachem because he had confessed to the King David Hotel attack in Palestine, in which 3 British citizens were killed. So at that time, there was still that awareness of history, I think, eroded to some extent in our time.
Well, I'm going to bring home a little bit more, obviously, to people some instances that you, I think, raised, or it was kind of linked to that article of yours. But there are names like Katie Hopkins, who has been hired, as it puts it within this quote, hired after homicidal anti-Muslim tweets and articles by, I assume, Jewish organisations. And there's also people like Rod Liddell, for instance, who are still at large, as it says, after various comments. I mean, he's a regular Islamophobe across Western media that is well known, doesn't get pulled up. You talk about the rapist Roman Polanski, the Jewish rapist. Now, if you say Jewish rapist, that'll immediately cause shrieks of horror, because when you say a Muslim groomer, that's okay. That seemed to have been okay for the media. You picked up this one where Oscars Academy Award Jewish rapist Roman Polanski, the best director Oscar for Holocaust drama The Pianist, has not. He got away with murder for a long while.
Absolutely, was made trying to get Kevin Hart to apologize for making an allegedly homophobic tweet. I wanted to, and it wasn't even a homophobic tweet from him, an African American actor. If you participate in our award ceremony, apologize. Whereas on the other hand, the highest their academy has to work.
Well, I know that the Mad Max actor, I always forget his name. I'm going to forget it, but I'm going to mention it anyway because everybody. He got pulled. Yeah, Mel Gibson. Thank you. He got notoriously lynched for some comments. I think he did make quite full-on comments, but actually the reality was that they didn't let him go. What did you follow that instance at all?
I did. I think the reason why Mel Gibson, 2 reasons why he got caught out there. One, because he made it. He Jews together or responsible for all the wars, but I guess he was a bit off his face at the time. He couldn't really make coherent arguments who have conflicts in the past. But if he put it that way, he would have had more room to maneuver, as it were. But because he just said the Jews, that's why the media rallied against him immediately.
Yeah, he rounded on the whole. Similar thing. Sorry, I lost your sound a little there.
I think it happened only a couple of weeks ago. In fact, with that MC Wiley, I believe his name was, a grime artist. He also made some tweets with Jewish managers in the industry, and he used
of course, it would be condemnable if people are saying those comments out of hatred for Jews or as an ethnicity or as a race, because they've actually registered themselves as a race, and that's what gives them a lot of power within certainly the British legal system, because they're not just a religion. You can be a Jew and be an ethnicity, not just a religion, unlike a Muslim. So being a member of Islam is not an ethnicity as such and isn't protected quite in the same way that a Jew would be protected. I think the Sikhs might be protected in the same way as a result as well. There's a distinction there. But, this business of the legal definitions of our identities has also reared its head within the what I would call the Zionist gay lobby. Peter Tatchell is a primary one on that. He loves to do a bit of Muslim bashing, and
Yes.
he's arguably within that camp. Is there any evidence for that, or am I just guessing?
I gave him a brief mention in my article because Peter Thatchell, as far as I can tell, he supports the LGBTQ agenda, whether they're Muslims or Christians, whatever. But he's very much against Iran and Pakistan, with whom are Palestinian, where the LGBTQ agenda or narrative isn't prevalent. It's not treated syllabus like it is in the West, and he's very much against both of those countries. I've seen him attend protests calling for regime in Iran, all sorts of accusations.
And what's also interesting, Kashif, I lost you there again. Were you still saying something? Sorry, I lost your sound.
I wasn't.
Okay, so this is interesting that you can see how across the very well-known celebrity circuit in different areas, in different communities, the gay community, the Hollywood community, and beyond, you can see that there is from time to time, there are controversies that erupt across media, and usually it's pinning down the folk who've maybe said something which is deemed to be anti-Semitic, and almost turns into a kind of witch hunt almost by the media. An example again is now actually a really interesting example that you might have alluded to as well was the case of a Jewish Israeli chap, Gilad Atzmon. Tell me a little bit about what the Zionist Jews or the Jewish extremists arguably did to him.
Yes, they banned. He's actually a saxophonist, quite well known, and they banned him from in under the exact borough, but they petitioned the MP there, and they censored him. They banned him from going about his livelihood.
Well, the thing is, this would obviously scare many people, because if the say arguably if the Zionist lobby is so powerful that it has its talons wrapped around establishment and can call on favors or lean on people or suggest or push forward legislation, you can see that could become an awful problem for anybody who's, for instance, a human rights activist on behalf of the Palestinian people, because with the way things are going and what's happened with the Labour Party, this kind of exceptionalism for Zionism and Israel, which is gathering pace within European and Western establishment in general, is not even hidden anymore. It's pretty much blatantly out on the table. And what does that do to the sort of activists? Because is that going to make people start self-censoring? Facebook, for instance, and the social media has now started moving in on anybody who does this. And I mentioned the fact that a former, I think, a member of the Justice Department, a very senior member of the Israeli Justice Department, Abby, her name was, I've forgotten her surname, but I'll come back with it, I'll dig it up. She actually has been appointed as Facebook's on Facebook's monitoring, overseeing board, if you like. So you can see that there is an influence which Zionism seems to have across Western Europe. Is that something that should really, or is it actually forcing activists to start self-censoring?
I think some will. On the other, to me, it reminds me a little bit of the last days of the East Berlin, or the last days of the apartheid regime, when things became so obvious, when the oppression, the tyranny became so vicious in your face that there was really nowhere else for it to go, but it had to collapse eventually. So similarly, I see now that the Israel lobby is, like you said, is so blatant, is so vindictive and openly vindictive in its and trying to ban pro-Palestinian voices, that its collapse is inevitable now, because it's become too much. It's become too obvious, and their crimes are no longer hidden, whether it's in Israel or elsewhere. So the activists, I think, have to hold firm. No one's going to. The more they hate the Israelis, the more the Israelis will crush them. And something we've seen throughout history. I don't think any oppressor has ever been persuaded by appeasement or kind words or compromise. It's just, you just have to keep pushing the narrative, which I say is the truthful narrative, and you just have to just go all out on it. Really, there's no backward steps, I would say.
Well, of course, the Zionists would argue that, look, Israel is, this is one of their standard lines, and I'll say it for the sake of balancing our discussion a little. They'll say that, look, we're a victimized people. We're oppressed in our own Middle Eastern region, and without the support of the West or the diaspora of the Jews, Israel itself, its whole existence is absolutely threatened, and therefore it's justified for us to use any means necessary to be able to sustain Israel, to sustain Zionism, because actually we're the ones who are the victims. I mean, this victimhood is really, in a way, what they use as a way to sort of suppress BDS, the divestment, movement. It's a way that they managed to get the Western media to almost create the impression that Hamas and the Israeli army fighting each other is in some way a proportionate battle, or that kids throwing rocks against Israeli tanks is a proportionate, if you like, struggle. There's a sort of victimhood which they're very good at, which and of that, you could argue that the Holocaust is one of the primary weapons that is used.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember there was an Israeli minister. Her name was Aloni Shumat. I think she was the agricultural minister at some point. And she said, the accusation of anti-Semitism, it's a trick, it's a tactic that we use around the world. And she said it on two occasions. One, I think, was with George Galloway, an interview, and another was on Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. We're talking about 2008, 2009. So she said, we use the accusation of anti-Semitism to shut down all debates about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. And it's a political tactic. To some extent, I can even understand that, because they have no moral or philosophical or political argument left. So the only card that they have to play is anti-Semitism, and they will play it continuously. But I think the fact that they've overplayed their hand in our time, that's backfiring on them now.
Well, you also talk about not being on the back foot and just being kind of apologetic about our stance in terms of Israelis or Zionists. And you talk very much about being, as you've hinted within your last comment, is being kind of on the front foot and taking the struggle to them. How do you think we should do that? How should that be done by say, Muslims or any justice-orientated activist or individual?
Well, these are just my views. It's not. I don't. It says that everyone else has their own opinion. When I started Forward March, I tried to think of what could be a couple of points that all Muslims or Christians, anyone who's pro-Palestinian, could unite around, that wouldn't be controversial for anyone to accept. So, the 5 points that I came up with, and again, these are just based on my own assessment. Nobody's 9/11 to start a fraudulent war on terror. I said this was the main point. The complete and unconditional restoration of the liberation of Palestine. 3, elimination of the usury-based central banking system around the world. 4, reparations for all the victims of Zionist terror, or anyone who has been caught up in this fake war on terror, whether there's people in Abu Ghraib or Fallujah or Bay. I thought these are points that anyone can agree on, and if they can use those as a starting point for their own work, articles, documentaries, what have you, that would undermine the fraudulent narrative itself. and I thought that would be a
Well, I
good
think
start.
it'd be worth going into a little more detail about each one of those points. I mean, and just giving us maybe a reason why those were particularly the 5 points that you've outlined. You mentioned usury in there and various others. Give us a little bit more of a reasoning why those are good strategies. Do you think?
Well, okay, just getting back to the fact that COVID-19 and investment by Dr. Sabowski, who was the Institute, U.S. Marine Corps First Airborne decorated veteran. And now the reason I thought that is important because that is in my view, that all pro groups and lobbies are using nowadays to demonize the Muslims and anyone who is pro-Palestine. So, and anyone who accepts that, in my view, has compromised themselves so much that that's that particular event. An important point for all pro-Palestinian people to acknowledge because so many other issues are linked to it.
And what about the usury issue that you mentioned? Why usury?
I think because, again, it's object of the influence of
I'm sorry, I think I'm losing the sound a little bit. I'll probably just ad lib a little bit and maybe pad those out until I get the sound
sure,
sorted.
yeah.
Oh, sure, no, we
I
can hear
thought
you again now.
okay, primarily because banking cartels such as the Rothschild cartel, J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, over the years, and it's quite a convoluted and dense subject. They have been involved in financing and financing conflicts and destabilizing countries. So I think this system, which relies on borrowing, usury, and then war as a means to get out of that debt, this is something that has to be addressed because it's a vicious cycle that plays out throughout history. Yeah, if you go as far back as the 1700s, maybe.
Well, that's fascinating. And there's something, I'm going to take a quote from the actual uh, article that you wrote. You talked again about this proactive dealing with the agenda, the Zionist agenda here. And what you said you mean by it is we don't wait around for the likes of Pam Geller, Richard Dawkins, or Melanie Phillips to attack us. Rather, we go after what these Israeli stooges represent as a given. Figuratively speaking, you say we hunt them in their lairs. We keep our forums and social media sites on point and purged of all infiltrators. We keep the enemy destabilized on the back foot and constantly in retreat. So you literally are reading this as a full-on war of, if you like, psychological soft power terror on Muslims in the West or anybody in the West who speaks against Zionism or Israel. Is that an exaggeration? Are you being too sort of if you like too paranoid maybe?
I guess I see it more as psychological.
Yeah, again, I'm not getting the sound, so I think that we might have lost you slightly there. But I will just continue because you said one of the errors that we have been making up until now was to focus on the individual offender rather than the corporation or the system that props them up and gives them succor. So you're talking about the media agencies, I assume the political organizations, the think tanks, the academic units which support them. Katie Hopkins, of course, famously worked for LBC and got sacked. So arguably there was some, recourse to justice there. But you regard her as an Israeli agent. But every company and CEO or director that's put people like her on their payroll is just as guilty. In fact, you say the facilitators and the enablers of Jewish extremism are worse than the Jewish extremists themselves because they're attempting to legitimize Jewish supremacist propaganda in society. Did you get that? Because we might have you back on the line. I just wanted to defer back to you. Do we still have Kashif? We may have lost Kashif. I'll give him a chance to speak in case he's there. Well, I think, the other point that I think, of course, we kind of covered was this issue of self-censorship and how detrimental it is to our ability to wage effective campaigns against Jewish extremism. Kashif recalls a conversation with a Palestinian activist, nice person, he says he was, but a standard liberal, and he was actually against the idea of forward marching, describing themselves as anti-Jewish extremism. And he was saying, like, can't you just say anti-Zionism? That would kind of get you out of using the Jewish word. But Kashif replied, well, we could, but why should we? Are pro-Israeli Jews restricted by self-censorship? Not at all. In fact, they're in the fake news industry, an industry set for the sole purpose of inciting Muslim-Christian conflict in the West. Kashif, anything to say on that one? If you're back with us, we may not have you, but in which case I'll carry on ad-libbing based on your pieces from the article. But it is extraordinarily pertinent question, really. Why are we self-censoring ourselves? And of course, you know, we've dealt on 20th Hour with another aspect of Israeli or Zionist power, and that is the ability to use interfaith dialogue as a way of getting into religious organization, Christian, Muslim, and even arguably the Jewish communities as well, to try and use their personal relationships, the friendships they garner, the pseudo friendships they garner with senior leaders within the Muslim community or even ordinary folk, as a way of kind of obviously humanizing Zionism and Zionists, but also at the same time to create links to be able to influence what Muslims do or say about Jewish extremism or Zionism, as Kashif would put forward. So Kashif, thanks for joining us again. But this issue you raised led me to start talking about the tactics which Zionists use to infiltrate Muslim organizations and individuals. They are pretty much masters of disguise in that sense. I mean, creating interfaith programs, cultural dialogue initiatives, using government as well to maybe bankroll some of those, and some is just stuff that the Jewish diaspora is mugged into a heading. But it is a danger as well, isn't it? If you let people into, say, the Muslim community, and then they start owning the narrative for us in terms of how we speak on Palestine. Kashif, if you're back with us, you're welcome to try to speak if there's a sound. It may be a sound issue that we're having, because I can't get anything. So feel free to butt in if you do manage to get that sound. Just jump in and I'll hear you, inshallah. Anyway, so Kashif says, so unless we openly accept the fact we're living under a Jewish dictatorship and have to play by their rules, I see no reason to pull our punches or spar with a group that's out for our heads. And wouldn't the acknowledgement of this fact be considered anti-Semitic in itself? He questions. Zionism is Judaism as practiced in the illegitimate state of Israel. That's what Kashif said earlier on the show as well, and he reiterates that. And by pro-Israeli Jews around the world too. So that kind of puts the question to our Israeli pro-Israeli friends, or the Jewish brethren here in Britain, the Board of Deputies, various others. I mean, where do they stand on this? If I was to say to them, look, I'm happy to condemn Muslim extremism as defined by whatever. There hasn't been a definition of extremism, but let me define Muslim extremism as ISIS or something, or Al Qaeda, or anybody who wants to commit a violent act against anybody else in the name of Islam without any sort of real rhyme or reason or self-defense, etc. Reason. I would be able to condemn that. I'd condemn on air now any Muslim who proactively goes to try to create violent extremism or acts in a way which is really abusive and insults other religions, or tries to sort of harm in any way other human beings using the name of Islam. That's just wrong. It's just not even recognizable within the Islamic canon, if you like. So it's very easy for me, without being a religious leader, to even say that. But would a Jewish person say the same about Zionists, who are clearly evidenced as being violent and you know, oppressive and you know, up to no good, effectively, across the Middle East, balkanizing the Middle East, investing in nuclear weapons to threaten all their neighbors, investing in all sorts of other military hardware. You know, it's all very, very provable that actually, you know, Zionism, as seen in the state of Israel in particular, is a very nasty piece of work. Apartheid itself is pretty much alive and well in Israel. You know, Palestinians don't get the same rights as their Israeli counterparts. Fact. Palestinians who are in the West Bank or etc. in those regions certainly get no fair deal whatsoever. In fact, whatever little they had is being confiscated daily by Jewish extremists, people who can't just be called Zionists, because most people in Israel would call themselves Zionists. But then you've got this version of like the settler type guys who go into these areas and are absolutely crazed. And they're certainly using religion. They would certainly argue that we're doing this in the name of Judaism. There's amongst the primary people who will say, well, we're here on a reclamation of ancient Jewish lands, and the Jewish religion needs to be established here. So Netanyahu has also started talking, well, he's virtually declared it a Jewish state. So it's a religious theocratic state which claims to be a secular democracy. Yet nobody wants to talk about that. Again, Israeli exceptionalism. You make your own mind up. I still would love if Kashif did come through. I think he's struggling with
I'm back with you, Mohsin.
Oh, you're back with you. So we've got about
Yes,
4 minutes. So I summarized quite a lot of what I thought was in your narrative, but do use the last 4 or 5 minutes to just give us a conclusion of your thoughts around, you know, our discussion today so far.
Well, hopefully, I think if there are any pro-Palestinian activists watching, they will understand that we are talking about making a distinction between extremists and between moderates and seculars, and our primary focus should be on the liberation of Palestine. In fact, I think Asghar once said that no resistance struggle in the history of liberation struggles has ever succeeded without offending the oppressor. So we must be not so concerned about are we offending Israelis, we'd be more concerned about are we helping Palestinians.
That's fabulous. And something you say in your articles, it says, we will convincingly win the war against Jewish extremism, but everyone has to do their part. Journalists, artists, and writers in particular. And I think you referenced a song by Judon and Naomi singing about revolutionary wind of change. So do you think creative content needs to improve our sort of our way we message and package the message of liberty of Palestine? Do you think we've done well enough? And is this one of the areas we could do better in?
Definitely, we could do better. I think there are outlets out there who are doing a good job. Like, for example, here, some programs like on Press TV elsewhere. But certainly, there is room for improvement, and I think we can do it. I mean, it's not really it's not that difficult to comprehend what's lacking and what we need to do. And I think if everybody does their part and speaks freely, speaks openly, include one in the conversation, doesn't generalize, I think then we can be very successful championing the pro-Palestinian and the pro-Kashmiri cause.
Well, I will talk about Kashmir, another favorite topic of both of ours, which we'll definitely adjust because a lot of the Israeli techniques are now being used by Hindutvas. The Israel solutions are being used to destroy Kashmiris and oppress them in the same way that Palestinians